Hi, thank you so much for coming to learn about my research. My name is Rebecca Kuperberg, and I'm a political science PhD student at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the United States. My research focuses on online violence against women in politics. So what is violence against women in politics? These four circles represent moments of violence against women in politics. Starting on the left, Juana Quispe, an indigenous counselor in Bolivia, whose death in 2012 led to the passing of the first law against violence against women in politics in the world, which was in Bolivia. Julia Gillard, Australia's only female prime minister, giving her famous misogyny speech about sexism and misogyny in the Australian Parliament. Jo Cox, former British Member of Parliament, murdered in 2016. And on the right, an example of a Facebook post, a Facebook threat targeting the US's youngest Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These acts of violence in different contexts and mediums have been conceptualized by academics and practitioners as violence against women in politics. Violence against women in politics is a broad range of harms that attack women as political actors. Following United Nations definitions, it's been described as having the following forms: physical, psychological, sexual, economic, and increasingly semiotic, which is the violence of images and words targeting an individual, but sending a message about the unworthiness of a group to a broader public. In recent scholarship, Paige Schneider and Mona-Lena Crook have argued for the disaggregation of violence against political actors from violence against women in politics. There's a lot of challenge in operationalizing this disaggregation because both can be occurring at the same time. And especially in the online space, determining the motive or the motivation underlying violence is challenging, if not, in most cases, impossible. Nonetheless, we can recognize that not all violence women politicians face is violence against women in politics. Instead, sometimes they face abuse that's politically motivated, motivated by partisanship or policy decisions. Scholarship and practitioner research on violence against women in politics has demonstrated that women disproportionately face abuse online in comparison to other spaces, underscoring the necessity for this type of research. However, despite the strengths of this existing research, there is little consistency in definitions, and there's limited theorizing of violence as it functions specifically in the online space. As such, these are some of the questions that arise out of existing work and guide my research. I, of course, won't be able to thoroughly answer all of these questions, but I'll focus on some of the ways that I'm theorizing, conceptualizing online violence against women in politics, and I present a typology to classify and measure it. Just to provide some context for this project, this piece is a part of my dissertation, which is on online intersectional violence against women in politics, comparing the UK and Mexico. I don't have the opportunity to go into all of the details now, but if you have questions about the justifications for applying an intersectional approach or the benefits of comparative analysis on this question, I look forward to discussing that in the comments. So a quick note on violence and why I use the word violence. So not everyone considers online violence to be violence. Political science especially largely views violence as an active force. We think about assault, physical assault, for example. But sociology and even some political scientists, and especially feminist researchers, often use a broader maximalist definition, focusing on the victim or survivor of violence, focusing on violence as violation, rather than the act or the perpetrator. This can also include violence that is unrecognized because it is so normalized. Alongside this, feminists have, for a long time, since at least as early as 1988, advocated an approach of thinking about violence as being part of a continuum. So I know this sounds like a spectrum from less to more severe, but that's not actually the intention of continuum thinking. Instead, a continuum of violence allows us to document and name the range of abuse that women experience. It also recognizes that normalized and exceptional violence are linked by common elements. Forms of violence reinforce each other, and they're not always easily distinguished, including by those who experience them. Not all acts of aversive speech on a continuum of aversive speech are violent, and certainly not all of them are criminal. But when we focus only on one type of abuse or one type of aversive speech, we limit our understanding of this landscape of aversion and violence that women experience. The continuum approach also recognizes that there is no objective measure of intensity, severity, impact, with the exception of acts that end in death. So we may be tempted to place offline sexual assault as worse or more impactful than psychological abuse or an online threat. But as third-party observers, that's not our role to do, because it depends so much on contextual factors and the individual experience of violence. Finally, the continuum approach recognizes that violence isn't always clearly categorized as one form or the other, and encourages us to grapple with the questions of the spaces in between, those gray spaces, which obviously is interesting theoretically and more challenging empirically and methodologically. So, moving to what existing typologies exist, there are numerous existing conceptualizations of online violence typologies to study it. In this next section, which admittedly includes a lot of information, I discuss 4 of these general groups in the literature: general online violence against politicians, cyber sexism, and online violence against women in politics. So I'm going to cheat a little bit to stay on time, but rather than go through these individually, I'll slowly make my way through, or kind of quickly make my way through, and you're welcome to stop and read any slides that you find interesting. For each slide, you'll find takeaways, a sample definition, and the target, or who's the focus of this kind of field of study. As a recognition, of course, I am greatly reducing the number of this is a very reductionist exercise, putting together all of these fields into one group, and it's ignoring a lot of the debates and nuance that take place within these fields of literature. Okay. Important to note that the pros and cons of each of these literatures isn't the general pros and cons of these literatures so much as what are the ways in which this can help us understand online violence against women in politics, and what are some of the obstacles to using this particular conceptualization or typology in understanding violence against women in politics specifically. And here I want to summarize. So to summarize some of the drawbacks, or really the insufficiencies for existing typologies on online violence against women in politics, say many don't incorporate what is unique about political officials. They may not really center their focus on political officials, which, if that's not their focus, is fine. But don't incorporate what could be unique about public officials as highly visible internet users in many contexts, who have a representative function and who use social media as a means to communicate with constituents. Many studies of online violence don't include indirect abuse in studies, but if the goal of online violence against women in politics is to exclude women from political public space, then this can take place with both direct and indirect abuse. Many studies use profanity as a measure, though profanity is not in of itself abusive or even aversive, and it can leave out stereotypes that are positive, such as describing a female politician as sexually attractive. And then finally, many studies don't consider intersectional discriminations, or how particular types of discrimination like sexism shift and change depending on context. But there are many really useful components of these existing typologies that can help us understand violence against women in politics. First, there are a lot of conceptualization systems. There's a lot to choose from. Most of these researchers and scholars use a family resemblance understanding to define online violence. So there's rarely just one form of violence or abuse under consideration, and a focus on the common elements that undergird them all. This group of research considers a wide range of contexts and actors. There are empirical and theoretical grounds. A lot of research focus is inductively generated using personal experience and empirical examples. In general, there's a focus on form and impact over motivation due to the nature of the online space. Research already includes discrimination or hate speech as a component, laying important groundwork for studying violence against women in politics. And then finally, particularly feminist research already sees this violence as part of a continuum, and recognizes the connectedness between offline and online abuse. So moving from these typologies and areas of research, I offer this theorization of online violence against women in politics. It is part of a continuum of aversive speech, as Chen writes from 2017, targets women in politics due to their standing within and representation of or association with a group like women, with the goal of affecting public perception of women engaging in political activity. What distinguishes violence against women in politics from violence against political actors, I argue, is that it targets political women or those associated with political women and is marked by hate speech, including discriminatory rhetoric and tropes. I conceptualize violence against women in politics also as a function of the target, form, and potentially response of abuse. Response isn't present in all cases, but vocalized response by generally by members of the public to abuse represents an avenue, I think, for really important future research. And I'll offer a slight disclaimer that this typology is, I think, particularly useful for public data as it incorporates the public function and impact of abusive speech. So in addition to theorizing this phenomenon, it hopefully provides a methodological pathway forward for researchers who are doing big N classification studies. I use examples from an original data set of Twitter posts that tag or incorporate the Twitter handle of female British members of parliament. So you'll see some of those examples throughout. And then you see at the bottom that I just want to underscore the importance of context, particularly geographic and linguistic context, which are necessary, especially as we encounter those gray areas between rudeness and abuse, between abuse and violence against women in politics. It is the role of context that can really help us classify posts. So rather than consider abuse directed only at a female politician, and not kind of this non-direct abuse, I argue that we should see a politician of interest at the center of a series of concentric circles, or as kind of the start of a ripple effect. Violence against family members, as seen in these sample tweets, might be classified as indirect, but still functions in these cases, I argue, to silence, exclude, or shame Diane Abbott, who's the first Black female MP in the UK. Second, a post targeting a politician or a politician's family can have ripple effects beyond the initial target, including to their family and staff who may be reading and responding to the post, to colleagues who are in similar positions that they are and may see the attack or the abuse as also functioning to abuse them, and then to the general public, which includes candidates and aspirants and people who may be looking to enter the political space more meaningfully. So relatedly, we have to recognize that individuals are targeted on the basis of a group. For example, we might see sexist abuse against women, and that targeted harassment on the basis of an in-group may be particularly significant. But if we understand the impact of violence against women in politics as going beyond the politician themselves, then we can understand that violence against women in politics is not limited to discrimination that matches, for lack of a better word, a politician's identification, because those forms of discrimination can still serve as a message to historically underrepresented groups or outgroups that they do not belong in politics. As for the form of violence, I conceptualize violence against women in politics as part of this continuum of aversive speech. So just a reminder that this is not a criminal continuum, and not all of these are necessarily bad or even undemocratic, certainly. We know that emotional language and sometimes rude language can actually be important for democratic discourse. And then, of course, we can't determine the impact from the category alone. So starting from spam or nonsense, this may not on its own cause any harm to anyone receiving spam or who encounters a lot of spam, as I think many of us do, but spam can reach a level of intensity that it can be bothersome. It can be really challenging for an MP or a politician to deal with. It can take away from their ability to respond to their constituents, etc. I distinguish rudeness from abuse because it's about political groups or policy rather than outgroup identity. Posts can be negative, offensive, or just impolite in this category without being abusive. Abuse, on the other hand, is negative, offensive, or impolite, but it's individually targeted or discriminatory towards an outgroup. And then violence against women in politics specifically targets a female politician, either through the content of the post or through tagging the politician or commenting on the politician's post, depending on the platform. And it incorporates discriminatory rhetoric, targeting the woman or her associates or those who ripple out from her, and occasionally other members of the public or members of an outgroup, including but not limited to through the use of gender-based violence and sexism. And then finally, harassment, which we see incorporated a lot in the cyber violence literature, is a pattern of abuse. So an individual post constitutes abuse or violence against women in politics, but a pattern can constitute harassment, particularly if it's viral, a large amount in a short period of time, continues unabated over a long period of time, or it's quantitatively significant. Where we study individual posts to understand and classify abuse and violence against women in politics and rudeness or incivility, a corpus of online posts is required to identify harassment. And then finally, in some cases, users respond to posts indicating their problematic nature. Here, a member of the public is recognizing a post as abusive. In this case, the original post from user A would be classified as violence against women in politics. So I just want to bring back this continuum thinking and the idea of impact. So violence against women in politics online violence against women in politics, is a form of semiotic violence targeting women as individuals to send a message to a broader group. As such, other women in politics, voters, and aspirants may be impacted by that abuse. The purpose of continuum thinking is to suggest that we don't know the specific impact as third-party observers, and we can't quantify objectively that impact, but understanding the spectra of targets, forms, and responses to abuse can help us identify where and how individuals might be impacted. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions.